Душе моя Господа, благословен єси, Господи, благослови, душе моя Господа, і вся внутрішня моя, ім'я святое Його.
I am honored to be here with you this afternoon. I was supposed to have a lighter schedule this summer, but it's proven to be much more complicated than I thought. So I was planning to be here for much more of the sessions, but conflicts have intervened, or demands. I'd like to begin with two general comments. One very practical, and it goes back to a number of decades ago when I was in the Jesuit novitiate. And one of my fellow novices was joking one night that his grandfather was a camel salesman in Damascus. So we all laughed except for Father Zogby, who was over from Lemoyne College and who knew there are no Latin churches in Damascus at that time, so that George was not Latin Rite and shouldn't be in a Latin Rite novitiate. So we did get that straightened out, but he left before ordination. So from the beginning, I had an introduction to some of the issues involved in the churches of the West and the East. My perspective will be heavily from Vatican II and papal magisterium. I know people, this is the second remark, give a lot of weight to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. However, there are gradations in the Catholic Church of the weight of teaching. And that which is taught by the Holy Father in virtue of either his office would carry greater weight than anything issued by a congregation, including the Doctrine of the Faith. And especially since John Paul II, in Ut Unum Sint on ecumenism, spoke very highly, I would give greater precedence, and most theologians would, to that encyclical than to the CDF. Now, one of the interesting things that I remind my students of in class is good Pope Honorius. If we're going to understand the role of the Bishop of Rome, we need to remember Honorius because he espoused one will in Christ, which eventually was condemned by an ecumenical council, and so was he. Now, he was not talking in virtue of office, as they now claim, but he was expressing an opinion as an individual. However we or others want to understand that, I think it's important to realize that the church does consist of men and women who do make mistakes and who do err. And in the Middle Ages, they tried creating a monk Honorius who was the cause of the error rather than the Pope. And again, it was an argument against papal infallibility at Vatican I. It's important to remember that, yes, there are individuals, and not everything expressed by an individual needs to be given the same weight. It depends on the basis for which he's acting, he's speaking, and the intentionality of those who issue the document. If the Catholic Church doesn't intend something to be taught infallibly, then no one else should give it that weight. So, Back to the main point of conciliar and papal magisterial expression of a constitutive ecclesiological concept. The decree on ecumenism uses the expression sister churches, and that occurs in the context of ecclesiology established by Lumen Gentium. So we have the decree on ecumenism, Unitatis Redintegratio, Lumen Gentium, some references in the decree on the Eastern churches, Orientalium Ecclesiarum, and then finally an explanatory note appended to Lumen Gentium. Cardinal Walter Kasper, one of the positive ecumenical developments since the Second Vatican Council is the fact that the churches of the East and West, after 1,000 years of separation, now recognize and designate one another as sister churches. I believe Walter Kasper, in addition to the weight that must be given to the Ecumenical Council, Vatican II, dependent or independent of whatever weight is given, is that it is the teaching of the Catholic bishops in communion with the bishop in Rome, and therefore has a certain weight. And I think the weight is greater, as Walter Kasper says, because a number of very important conciliar perspectives and teachings were not new in the sense of introducing a change, but rather reflected a sensitive, scholarly, and reflective return, perhaps restoration, to the lived experience of the early church. Too often, reference was made to Trent rather than to the early church. Lumen Gentium 8 reminds us that the church can be understood in an analogous way to a sacrament or even to the incarnation, inasmuch as Jesus Christ is truly human and truly divine. Christ, the one mediator, this is Lumen Gentium 8, set up his holy church here on earth as a visible structure, a community of faith, hope, and love, and he sustains it unceasingly, and through it he pours out grace and truth on everyone. This society, however, equipped with hierarchical structures and the mystical body of Christ, the visible assembly and the spiritual community, must not be considered as two distinct things, but as forming one complex reality comprising a human and divine element. For it is therefore by no mean analogy that it is likened to the mystery of the incarnate Word. The church understood, analogously with the incarnation, serves as a very helpful reminder of both aspects of the church, both of the church as established by Jesus Christ. Yes, it is divine, and yes, it will endure time under the guidance of the Spirit. But inasmuch as the church is historical, in addition to being divine, it's human, and the church program way amidst the persecutions of the world and the consolations of God. The church is always in need of purification. It pursues unceasingly penance and renewal. Again, a salutary reminder that yes, we can examine different aspects of the teaching on the Catholic Church and then determine whether or not they're constitutive of the church as church, or whether they might be historically contextualized, that at a particular point in time they were necessary but are no longer necessary. There must be constitutive elements in as much as the church is both divine and human, but it takes careful reflection to determine which is which. Again, the issue of Pope Honorius, an error. Lumen Gentium, the Constitution on the Church, had an interesting explanation introducing the text. And the explanation, the nota praevia explicativa, the preliminary note of explanation, was clarifying chapter 3 of Lumen Gentium to get everybody at the council on board on what it was teaching. First and foremost, when we're talking about the College of Bishops, again, from the Catholic Church perspective, it's not a college of equals, but rather a stable group. Again, the Catholic Church would teach that there is a constitutive role for the Bishop of Rome within the college, and so they wanted to clarify college is not used in the sense of a group of equals. The other points are more positive. A bishop, as bishop, becomes a member of the episcopal body by sacramental consecration, so the sacrament, and by communion with the head and members of the college. We'll see where this will come up again. So, yes, you need sacramental ordination to, in potency, have the power of a bishop. That can be exercised provided there is some determination of an assignment to a diocese or something. But as Joseph Ratzinger commented on in the 60s, this is one of the elements that can change through time as to how exactly a bishop is given a munus of responsibility and office. As long as the authority of the church accepts it, it would be legitimate. Another interesting point, incidentally, is one can compare Joseph Ratzinger as an expert at Vatican II, as a professor of theology, as Archbishop of Munich, as prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and as Benedict. We all grow and develop, hopefully, over time, but it is definitely clear when you read Ratzinger's early statements, his openness and enthusiasm for the council became muted over time, whether or not it was, as many suggest, by extremism on both sides. But again, we have to recognize his opinions have changed over time. And therefore, when the preliminary note of explanation talks about hierarchical communion, Ratzinger can say the church's legal or juridical development occurs through the intercommunion of churches that are governed by bishops. That is, in a hierarchical fellowship of sacramental content. Hierarchical communio is intended to make it as clear as possible that communion as conceived of in the ancient church is both juridically and ontically the fundamental structure of the church for all time, and therefore in our day as well. Perhaps communio ecclesiology is the way to resolve a number of these issues. The nota, the preliminary explanatory note also states that the order, College of Bishops, is also the subject of supreme and full power over the universal church. Again, from the Catholic perspective, provided it remains united with its head, the Roman Pontiff, and never without its head. Further, in reference to that point, the Pontiff, the Bishop of Rome, may, for the good of the Church, act alone, whereas the consent of the Bishop of Rome is required for the collectivity of bishops to act in a collegial manner. The Supreme Pontiff, as Supreme Pastor of the Church, can exercise his power at all times as he thinks best, as is required by his very function. On the one hand, you have the unique role of the Bishop of Rome within the order of bishops. Then you have this phrase, as is required by his very function. Paul VI had made a suggestion to the Theological Commission that perhaps Lumen Gentium could add the phrase, the Pope is answerable to God alone. Yeah, and the Theological Commission said, Your Holiness, we'd love to do it, but it's not true. Tradition, sacraments, there are a number of constitutive elements of the church that the Bishop of Rome can't change. And in fact, when Pius XII redid the ordination liturgy, the theologians had to clarify first that what he was changing was not constitutive of the sacrament, or otherwise he wouldn't have been able to change it. And so, even though there's a unique role for the Bishop of Rome, as required by his very function or munus, therefore, there are certain elements, as Ratzinger would say, where he would be morally required, not by law, but morally required, to consult with the bishops. Finally, the Theological Commission decided to avoid all problems and stated, in order for a bishop to be bishop, you need the sacrament, sacramental consecration, and communio with head and members. The Theological Commission decided that they should not get into questions about laicity and validity. These are left for the discussion of theologians, especially with regard to the power that is in fact, de facto, exercised among our Eastern separated brothers and sisters, and there is a variety of opinions on how this is to be explained. There is the fact, and then there's the theology, which seems to be lagging behind the fact. In the decree on ecumenism, Unitatis Redintegratio, For many, the Decree on Ecumenism number 14. For many centuries, the Church of the East and that of the West each followed their separate ways, though linked in a brotherly union of faith and sacramental life. The Roman See, by common consent, acted as guide when disagreements arose between them over matters of faith or discipline. Among other pleasure for this council that there flourish in the East many particular or local churches, among which the patriarchal churches hold first place, and of these not a few pride themselves in tracing their origins back to the apostles themselves. The decree is returning to the first millennium when the Bishop of Rome acted by common consent as guide when disagreements arose. Following that statement, these churches, though separated from us, possess true sacraments, above all by apostolic succession, the priesthood, and the Eucharist, whereby they are still linked with us in closest intimacy. So the issue is, yes, there are vera sacramenta, true sacraments, and yes, there's true apostolic succession. Unitatis Redintegratio continues, the Eastern churches followed their own disciplines, which were sanctioned by the approval of the fathers of the church, of synods, of ecumenical synods. Far from being an obstacle to the church's unity, a certain diversity of customs and observances only adds to her beauty and is of great help in carrying out her mission. To remove all shadow of a doubt, this synod solemnly declares that the churches of the East have the right to govern themselves according to the disciplines proper to them, since these are better suited to the character of the faithful and more for the good of their souls. It does note the perfect observance of this principle is sanctioned by long-standing tradition, but in fact has not always been followed. And the need to follow it is a prerequisite for unity. So you have variety in customs, variety in observances. You have the right to govern themselves. They have true apostolic succession and sacraments. And in fact, the decree also states that the Catholic Church would benefit from differences in the theological expression of doctrine. It is hardly surprising if from time to time one tradition has come nearer to a full appreciation of some aspects of a mystery of revelation than the other, or has expressed it to better advantage. In such cases, these varied theological expressions are often considered to be mutually complementary rather than conflicting, and such diversity belongs to the full Catholic and apostolic character of the Church. As Walter Casper explains, the Eastern churches have their own manner of being church. They have not received their ecclesial being from the Latin Church. On the contrary, the Latin Church owes much to them. The Latin Church is therefore not the mother but sister of the Eastern churches. The relationship is not a dependent mother-daughter, but a fraternal communion. Orientalium Ecclesiarum on the Eastern churches, it primarily refers to the Eastern Catholic churches, but does emphasized that the Eastern churches not in full communion possess valid sacraments and therefore recognized apostolic succession. And therefore they could, with dialogue on both sides and discussion, approach a more lenient way of acting of reference to the sharing in the sacraments, communicatio in sacris, provided both sides agree due to apostolic succession and the truth of the sacraments. As noted this morning, in addition to the conciliar documents on sister churches and the Eastern churches, Paul VI used the expression sister church, which was the first time it occurred, according to Casper, in papal teaching in his letter to the ecumenical patriarch. Pope Paul stated, "Since this mystery of divine love is at work in every local church, is not this the reason for the traditional expression sister churches, which the churches of various places used for one another? For centuries, our churches lived in this way like sisters, celebrating together ecumenical councils, which defended the deposit of faith against all corruption. Now, after a long period of division and mutual misunderstanding, the Lord, in spite of the obstacles, gives us the possibility of rediscovering ourselves as sister churches." And the correspondence between the Patriarch and the Pope were gathered together in the Book of Charity, pardon my expression, Tomos Agibus. Pope Benedict, references that text in the Plenary in Istanbul in 2006 during the celebration of the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom on the feast of St. Andrew the Apostle with the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew I. The Pope begins by referencing the special relationship uniting the churches of Rome and Constantinople as sister churches, and says with heartfelt joy, "We thank God for granting new vitality to the relationship that has developed since the memorable meeting in Jerusalem in January 1964 between our predecessors, Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras. Their exchange of letters testifies to the depth of the bonds that grew between them." Paul VI, Benedict, using the expression sister churches, most explicitly in papal teaching is in the encyclical Ut Unum Sint, that they may be one, by John Paul II. All of this, these uses by Paul and Benedict, and especially this encyclical, sister churches cannot be a mere turn of phrase or a general description. Rather, it is a significant ecclesiological concept essential to progress in the relationship between the churches of the East and West. As Casper notes, this new linguistic usage, sister churches, indicates a shift in the relationship of the Catholic Church to the Eastern Church, which had been introduced by Pope Leo XIII, among other things, condemning any Latin priest who would encourage a conversion from an Eastern Church to the Latin Church. Needs to be remembered. The unity of the church, communio among the churches, requires agreement on the deposit of faith and on the constitutive elements of the church as church. But it doesn't require uniformity in practice, worship, and structure. I know that there are individuals on both sides of the divide who take more security in knowing what is to be believed, and they want clarity. I don't think Holy Mother Church always possesses full clarity, at least as a historical entity in the world. Again, there is the divine element. May 25th, 1995, John Paul II encyclical on commitment to ecumenism. The Pope emphasizes conciliar ecclesiological insights, including Lumen Gentium 8, which states clearly and unequivocally the one Church of Christ subsists in the Catholic Church. The text as promulgated reflects the explicit intention of the Council Fathers, who unambiguously rejected the single copulative est in favor of subsisted in, and thus any interpretation of Lumen Gentium that would equivocate the two terms argues against the mindset of the Council Father and contradicts the text. There's a note from Alois Grillmeyer. The Theological Commission deliberately chose subsisted in. There were other attempts at various times to replace it with est or other expressions, and all were rejected. And the Theological Commission offered this, and the Fathers accepted it. Pope John Paul II, in his encyclical, reiterates that the Church has maintained its unity with all the means which God wishes to endow His Church, while noting the Catholic Church does not forget that many among her members cause God's plan to be discernible only with difficulty. Speaking of the lack of unity among Christians, the decree on ecumenism does not ignore the fact that people on both sides were to blame and acknowledges responsibility cannot be attributed only to the other side. By God's grace, however, neither what belongs to the structure of the Church of Christ nor that communion which still exists with the other churches and ecclesial communities has been destroyed. The elements of sanctification and truth present in the other communities constitute the objective basis of communio. And to the extent that these elements are found in other Christian communities, the one Church of Christ is effectively present in them. He also cites the statement that in reference to the Orthodox churches, through the celebration of the Eucharist of the Lord in each of these churches, the Church of God is built up and grows in stature. Truth demands that all this be recognized. The purpose of his encyclical, the purpose of ecumenism. Our declared purpose is to reestablish full unity in legitimate diversity. In virtue of the apostolic succession, we are united more closely by the priesthood and the Eucharist. By participating in the gifts of the God to His Church, we are brought into communion with the Father through the Son in the Holy Spirit. In each local church, this mystery of divine love is enacted, and surely this is the ground of the traditional and very beautiful expression, sister churches, which local churches were fond of applying to one another. He also cites, John Paul II cites, the church's journey beginning in Jerusalem on Pentecost and its original unfolding in the oikumene of that time, centered around Peter and the 11. Her unity during the first millennium was maintained with these same structures through the bishops, successors of the apostles, in communion with the Bishop of Rome. Cardinal Walter Kasper also recognizes a significant difficulty that was raised this morning. Both the Eastern Orthodox churches and the Catholic Church understand themselves to be the one church of Jesus Christ, but the former, unlike the Second Vatican Council, have not replaced this definition with the more open statement that the Church of Christ subsists in the Catholic Church. He suggests the ecclesiology of communio may provide an ecclesiological basis for progress. Each local church can regulate its affairs, but it can only do this in communio with all the other local churches and with the universal church. Kasper refers to another text of John Paul II on Cyril and Methodius in describing the goal of communion, united but not absorbed. Kasper notes the reestablishment of full unity between East and West can only be a pneumatological, charismatic process open to grace. Cyril and Methodius, according to John Paul, are as it were the connecting links or bridge between the Eastern and Western traditions. For us, they are the champions and patrons of the ecumenical endeavor of the sister churches of East and West for the rediscovery through prayer and dialogue of visible unity in perfect and total communion. The unity which is neither absorption nor fusion. In conclusion, Lumen Gentium describes the Church analogously as sacrament or as the Incarnation. She's both organized society and the mystical body of Christ, an earthly church and a church endowed with heavenly gifts. Through the centuries, the Church has had to strive against an overemphasis on one aspect to the neglect or detriment of the other. For example, Bellarmine's definition of the church definitely included a spiritual dimension, but given the polemics of the time, emphasis was on the visible dimension. That's what I mean by emphasizing one over the other. Paul VI recognized this when he was talking about the revision of the law for the Latin Church. He emphasized the dangers of creating or fostering false dichotomies within the church, as though liberty or the freedom of the children of God stood in contradistinction to law, or law as opposed to charity, ministry as opposed to the church's hierarchical constitution. And so the question, and I think perhaps an element in communio, is less either or, but both and. More inclusive than exclusive. In the Latin Church, for example, marriage is considered both covenant and a contract. You can't ask, is it a contract or is it a covenant? It's both. Depending on the context and how you understand the terms and all those matters, they determine whether we're looking at it from one perspective or another. Based on conciliar texts as well as post-council papal magisterium, the expression and use of sister churches reflect significant ecclesiological elements present in the churches of the East and West. True sacraments, valid apostolic succession, the right to govern themselves, legitimate variety by which theological truths find expression in different ways. Positively expressed, full unity among the churches would allow the Eastern Orthodox churches to offer significant and valuable contributions to the church's life, now possible only in a limited way through the Eastern churches in communion with the Bishop of Rome. I asked Patrick Granfield once, I said, if there are true sacraments and valid apostolic succession, are Orthodox bishops members of the College of Bishops? Either they are or they're not. If they're not, well, how can there be valid apostolic succession if valid apostolic succession is integral to the concept of faith and ministry going back to the apostles? To what extent is the role of the Bishop of Rome an element within the college? Is the College of Bishops existing in imperfect communion at this point? These are serious theological issues and questions that need to be addressed, and I think could form a basis for progress on the communio model. As John Paul II stated, the structures of unity which existed before the separation are a heritage of experience that guides our common path toward the reestablishment of full communion. Obviously, during the second millennium, the Lord has not ceased to bestow on His church abundant fruits of grace and growth. Unfortunately, however, the gradual and mutual estrangement between the churches of the West and East deprived them of the benefits of mutual exchanges and cooperation. With the grace of God, a great effort must be made to reestablish full communion, the source of such good for the Church of Christ. This effort calls for all our goodwill, humble prayer, and steadfast cooperation, which never yields to discouragement. The traditional designation of sister churches should ever accompany us along this path. I would suggest it is fact, not fiction, but it may legitimately be asked how well or how poorly all the people of God express these facts in and through their lives and actions, as well as through theological reflection. Thank you.